The Lord be with you. Is that a little loud? Is that a little loud? We good? Okay. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we ask that as we dive into your word, as we continue through our 2-year read through the Bible, through your word, through your story of everything, and learn your will for us, we ask that you help us to read, mark, learn, inwardly digest, take to heart all of your commands, Lord, that we may live our lives according to you. All this we pray in your precious and holy name. Amen. Leviticus, the dreaded book that stops everybody at the beginning of their read through the Bible. At some point, I'll stop making that joke. Leviticus is a good book, and we'll get into the reasons why that's a good book. Well, thank you. Leviticus. We'll address the elephant in the room, or so to speak, the sacrificial bull in the room. Yeah, it's a lot of laws. It's very wordy. It's very repetitive. And a lot of people ask the question, really, what's the point? So we're going to get to that. The big picture for everybody is that Leviticus is about keeping Israel. It's all about keeping Israel clean, both them knowing that they belong to God and the other nations around them knowing that Israel belongs to God. And along with that, when it comes to his laws, we want to make sure that we look at not necessarily the laws in a literal form, but why they're being made and how that connects to how creation was supposed to be. That's what we look for in these laws with Israel. What was good governance? What was the meaning behind it for what life was supposed to be like? We'll get into all of that, assuming I talk fast enough. So just to give you a little bit of the introduction there to Leviticus, there is a good reason for us to read it. Be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. This is kind of the tagline of Leviticus. If you wanted a theme verse for Leviticus, especially for our readings, but the whole second half of Leviticus focuses on this line. And it's really God defining the relationship. We've already seen that God is revealing himself to Israel. They've made the covenant. Now here is what the covenant entails. More than just the 10 Commandments, but what are you going to do as my people? The name Leviticus comes from the Vulgate translation, so that's Latin, but it's just the word for Levite, which is who the priests were, because this tends to all be relatively priestly laws, especially the beginning with the offerings and whatnot. But the Hebrew name, I think, goes more with the actual theme of Leviticus, where the Hebrew name is "and he called." And he called, speaking of God calling Israel to be his own, and what that entails. Some phrases that are repeated a lot. There is a lot of repetition in Leviticus. Maybe you noticed that in your readings. But the Lord spoke to Moses, is said 37 times. There are 37 separate speeches in here where God is commanding something. Holy is said 90 times. Atonement said 40. There's a lot of repetition, and there is a lot of theme repetition as we go throughout. You can read kind of the rest of these as you go, but understanding sin is a big part of it, and God calling Israel to be a nation set apart. This was frequently read. Remember, for Israelites and then Jews, they had to memorize the Torah, right? So the Leviticus was also memorized. And it was something often taught to children as well. This was not one of the books that they waited until later to teach the kids. This was something from the beginning because they would learn their place as God's people. So why so many offerings? Right? There are 5 different offerings at the beginning. I'm cutting a little bit into last week, but we really didn't talk about Leviticus last week. 5 different offerings. We've got the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. And all of these would be regular. Some of them were even daily offerings. In the tabernacle was never quiet. So Linda came up and asked me a question. That would be a lot of blood, wouldn't it? Because they're doing all the slaughtering at the entrance to the courtyard of the temple. So if you remember Pastor's diagram from last week, they've got the courtyard around the tabernacle. They would have done all the slaughtering at the entrance to that courtyard. The fat, the organs, the hide, all of that would have been taken outside of camp and burned. And then the meat itself would have been burnt for the offering, which then would have been given to the priests to sustain themselves. Just to give you the overview of the offerings there, part of the purposes behind these offerings is that with the offerings have a twofold purpose. One is to provide for the priests. You'll hear it in the sermon again, but I'll go a little bit further on that. The priests did not, they were Levites, they didn't have land, they couldn't raise cattle, they didn't have ground to grow wheat or other crops on. So they were, God chose to sustain them, to continue to give them food and keep them alive and well through these offerings. The priest ate the offerings, and then whatever wasn't finished was burned away. It's a little bit different, though, than how they think of priests of these offerings make a distinct difference from the offerings made to pagan gods, though. There's a reason that God takes all of the fat and all of the organs and puts it outside of camp and burns it and doesn't let it have any part. And it's because the pagan gods, that part was always burned to their false gods. They always took the best part and they would always burn it like the god needed to eat it. And God sent it outside and completely got rid of that best part of the meat as a sign that you aren't here feeding me. These offerings are me feeding you. And they also, so none of the meat was offered to God in the sense that God needs it to survive. It was pleasing to him that they were offering these sacrifices, but it wasn't something that God needed in terms of sustenance. Whereas that was kind of the idea of these false gods, was that they were giving these foods and the best parts of the meat to try and appease them and try and feed them and make them full and happy. That is not the case for how these sacrifices are working for Yahweh, for God of Israel. So these sacrifices were for the priests to sustain them as well, but they were also there in many regards to keep Israel clean. They were sacrifices for the sins they knew they committed, and there were sacrifices for the ones they committed unintentionally. And we'll look at some of those unintentional ones. The burnt offering was the ones leaning towards the sins they actually committed. But we'll look at this. Those arrows never work well because they always hop pages. There are various levels of sin offerings. That was the start of our reading, chapter 4. And it all depended on the status of who committed it. Whether it was the priests, the assembly of Israel, the leader of a clan, or a commoner, these different levels required different sacrifices befitting the individual. So the priest, they had to do, it ranges from the larger, more important animals. I believe it was the bull. The assembly had the goat without, the male without blemish. A leader also had something along those lines, something from their flock. And then the commoners, the normal people of Israel, would have needed 2 birds. And so they've got those various levels for the position that they're in as well. Recognizing that the higher of a position you are, there is more of a responsibility for the example that you hold before people. So even if you're sinning unintentionally, which is kind of the big key with these sin and guilt offerings, right? It's God's recognition that, hey, when you sin unintentionally and it's brought to your attention, here's what you need to do. Because just because you didn't know it was a sin doesn't mean that it wasn't a sin. And so he sets that up, and it shows a little bit of the hierarchy there, but it's more of the fact of they're in that position. They need to be held to a higher example. So those are the different levels of sin offerings, depending on your position there. And there is a difference between sin and guilt. It sounds the same. You're like, why do you need 2 different things? Don't you have guilt for sin? The sin offering is for your regular everyday sins that you go and commit. Your guilt offering is for sins specifically committed against holy things, or as they kind of lay out a few examples, against your neighbor specifically. Like if I just went up and, oh, Kevin's not here for me to insult. Oh well, I won't do it then. But it's like if I just went up and it would be my direct insult and my direct sin against Kevin, that would be included in this guilt offering. So usually it's against the holy thing. So when they mess up the sacrifice, when they bring uncleanness into the temple, when they do something wrong with the holy fire or the different parts of the tabernacle, so like the candlesticks or the altars, the Holy of Holies, when something along those lines is made unclean or sinned against, that would be where the guilt offering would come in. So it's like a subset of sorts, but it is its own thing of the sin offering. And these are all five of these offerings would be done regularly. Most of them probably happening on a daily basis. So those are the offerings. I've got a little bit of a thing there for you guys to look at. We won't go over it in depth, but it's the places where the offering is found and how Christ fulfills those offerings. Now, I know they sound the same, but that's because the offerings are all very similar to each other. So there's just the tiny intricacies there. The burnt offering always required a male without blemish. And it was the sacrifice done daily for the actual sins of the people of Israel. And so Jesus was the sacrificial lamb, the lamb without blemish, the sign of the Passover. All of that come together in one with Christ there. Grain offering. The grain offering was a lot more of the focus of, again, feeding the priests, and Jesus continuing to do that with us today. These aren't necessarily reinstituted in our lives, but that they are fulfilled by Christ. And that's the difference, right? So we talk about the laws and how Christ fulfilled the Old Testament laws. It doesn't mean that he did and followed all. He didn't break any, but it's not like that he specifically went out to follow each of the 613 laws and then each of the little buffer laws that the Jews made, but that all of the laws pointed to Christ's fulfillment as the Son of God, making his sacrifice for the forgiveness of our sins. So the laws of the offerings all point to Christ as the offering, as the sacrifice. That's where we find fulfillment. It's not necessarily that, hey, they did all this, Christ came, and now it doesn't matter. Or Christ came, and now we should be doing it as well. It's Christ came because they were all pointing to Christ. So when we talk about him fulfilling the Old Testament law, that's what we're talking about, that all of the law points to him, and that in his sacrifice, he makes us ritually clean. We are made righteous by him. These offerings to assuage our consciences, these offerings to make us clean, they're no longer needed because of Christ, because he's fulfilled them, because he was the sacrifice that they couldn't be. Any questions on the sacrifices, on the offerings? Otherwise, we'll keep moving.
At the end of chapter 3 about all fat is the Lord's. And it's just kind of interesting over time, culture, fat, just not thought of good as much now. Back then it sounded like fat was.
So the thing back then, to separate the offerings a little bit, was that the fat was always the best part of the meat, right? That was always what was offered. So the fat is the Lord's, meaning the Lord decides what to do with it. But he makes that distinction by taking that fat and having it burned outside of camp. Whereas most ancient society, the fat was the best part. We all agree on that, but they would burn that for their gods like their gods needed food. And when
you don't think about that being necessarily good now.
We don't necessarily think that, no, you don't like fatty meat. You know, when you're buying your hamburger, you try to buy leaner because the cheap stuff just shrinks down on you, right? So that is a little bit of a cultural change that's happened. But there's a lot of cultural changes that have happened when it comes to the meat industry, right? The killing of an animal in any regard always used to be a very, and this is a downfall, I think, of modern society. It always used to be a very sacred thing, because I almost changed the title to Blood is Life. I changed it from Blood is Life to the theme verse. But the other big point of Leviticus is that blood is life. It carries the life of the creature, it carries the life of the human. That's why when you touch blood, you're being made unclean. And we'll get more into that. But all the laws around it was that God cared about when even the life of his domestic creatures like cattle, even when those lives were taken, God wanted it to be known that they're taking a life in doing that. There was an importance to this sacrificing. And so the whole meat industry kind of moved away from that. You know, it always used to be the priests who were butchers. And we see that in the New Testament even. And we moved away and we've made it a very impersonal thing. Just an interesting offshoot. Melissa?
The fat in the is the least amount of the, I mean, there's more meat than there is fat, right? And we're also supposed to tithe 10% versus, so we still asking for part of it, so it's kind of like a tithing too, isn't it? Or not so much?
He gets to tithing in different parts of the offerings based on the sins that you've committed. You should bring a certain amount with you if it's been against a person. I wouldn't say that the fat is necessarily tithing so much as that separation of it is mine, but you're not sacrificing that to me. You know, that's not, we're going to separate you from what every other pagan nation does. I don't need this to sustain. It's already mine. Take it out. Fun fact with you, I should have grabbed a picture, and I think I've looked this up, but the sheep are not the sheep that we imagine when we see pictures of sheep. They had the fat-tailed sheep back in Israel back in that time, so they would have had a really long tail that was just huge and full of fat. Fun fact for you. I don't have a picture. I should have grabbed a picture, but I wasn't thinking about it. I could, and then it'll take 5 minutes for me to figure that out. Moving forward. Oh, yeah. Kathy?
Numbers of people that would make sacrifices. I mean, you're talking of a congregation, well, hundreds of thousands of people. They can't all go to the tabernacle daily. So how do they arrange that?
So, and Pastor can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm just here to teach. He's here to have everything memorized. When it comes to like the burnt offerings, and this is the big thing that we talk about when we talk about the offerings, none of them were private. The offerings were always a congregational event. It wasn't, and so God from the beginning talked about being in community with him. This wasn't in, and this is why they make the laws about the altars that we talked about later on. He makes the laws about where you're to make the sacrifice because it's supposed to be in communion with the whole congregation. You're not going off and sacrificing by yourself. You're not doing something for your own gain out there. What we're doing is living in community with God, but it's the whole community. It's every sacrifice was a public event. And so the burnt offering was done twice a day, morning and evening, but that was a burnt offering the whole congregation took part in. The grain offerings and different things, those would have been brought in, but they wouldn't have necessarily been, every single individual doing it. I don't believe. Peace offerings. And the sin and guilt offerings come down for when you've sinned unintentionally and it's been brought to your attention. A great thing that I wanted to talk about, I love how it phrases that. When you sin unintentionally, meaning you don't realize you're doing it, but it's brought to your attention. What does God lay out there that we see later addressed by Jesus in Matthew 18? Well, forgiveness, yes, that's seen in the offerings, but with Matthew 18, right, go to your brother if he sinned against you. God lays out here, if you've sinned unintentionally and it's been brought to your attention, we're supposed to actively care about our neighbors, our brothers, when we say neighbors, I'm talking about Israel here. We're supposed to care about them. When we see them sin, it's good for us to bring it to their attention. And when it's brought to our attention, we're supposed to accept that, and the Israelites were supposed to go and offer a sin or a guilt offering, depending on what they did wrong. Now, the Israelites were nowhere near perfect, and they were a lot like us. So how often do you think that a sin was brought to somebody's attention, and they thought they actually sinned and was like, I need to go do a sacrifice right now? Well, they sinned daily. They should have been doing those sacrifices daily. But do you think that everybody who was told, hey, you sinned against me, you really need to go do a sacrifice, you think everybody went and did it? Absolutely not. the Israelites weren't better than anybody we have today. Um, there wouldn't be any animals left. And so that's always the thing of what God institutes, and we see right away the faults that Israel is going to come to. There's no way they're offering enough sin and guilt offerings for everything they've done, which is what comes about with the Day of Atonement that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Yeah, Jerry?
Would there be more than one, say, bull that would be offered? Wasn't the single large animal representative of whatever other sacrifices that could be offered? You know, the quail and the small.
So the sacrifices, especially with the sin offerings, it depended on who was giving it. The sin offerings and the guilt offerings were more on the personal side, but they weren't, it was still a public event. They were coming forth, and that was kind of their public confession and apology when they did a sin and guilt offering. And those had the different levels of animals depending on what your position was. The burnt offering, the peace offering, and the grain offering were always the same thing. And then God usually gives caveats based on if you don't have this. But for those three, that's the priest doing that sacrifice on behalf of Israel. That was always usually the same thing happening there with those. So we get the priesthood established. Aaron and all his sons are set up as priests. And then two of his sons, Nadab and Abihu, well, they done messed up Aaron. So they done messed up and they get killed immediately. And at first, it can seem a bit odd for that retribution. You just set them up as priests, and now you're going to kill them. And we don't always, that always, whenever we see God do violence, right, it always sits weird with us because we want to bring God down to our level, and we think, well, he should be loving and kind and never hurt anybody. But that's really, we lose the idea of the fear part of fear, love, and trust in God whenever we think like that. God is the creator and all things belong to him. And when he sets the standard of how things should be, there's a level of fear along with the love and trust that we have for him. And what we see with Nadab and Abihu, what their wrongdoing was, is that they were not taking it seriously. There was a lack of respect for the priestly office. They went in and they took unauthorized fire, and they started doing a sacrifice of their own and trying to do something apart from what God commanded. And when you're doing something apart from what God commanded, but you're trying to do a command of God, but you're doing extra, right? Are they doing it for God? Or are they doing it for themselves because they're the priests and look, we're going to do this extra thing and it's going to be pretty special when we do it? There was a lack of respect for the priestly office. They were really trying to lift themselves up with that. One commentary even suggests that they were doing it drunk, that they were just completely out of sorts and shouldn't have been doing anything at all, which would go the opposite direction of malevolently doing it for their own benefit to unintentionally doing it for their own benefit. But it still ends up being not what God commanded. It ends up being the exact opposite and trying to lift themselves up instead as priests, trying to do extra, trying to get extra for themselves. And we see that God's action is quick against that. And there's a story from Acts 5. Arlen, I know for sure, can tell me all about this story, but anybody in the men's Bible class who was here 3 years ago when we were in that chapter, 2 chapters ago, what story from Acts 5 parallels this event? I'll tell you it's not a question you have to answer unless you want to, Arlen. Myral, you want to answer that one? Okay, Art, you want to answer?
I missed that chapter.
Okay, all 3 weeks of it. Ananias. I'm just joking. We always have great conversations there, so we never get through as much as we plan. Pastor. Ananias and Sapphira, absolutely. At the beginning of the new church, Ananias and Sapphira, everybody is bringing in the money that they sold. And what did Ananias and Sapphira do? They said, we sold our house and we're giving everything. But what didn't they actually do? they didn't give everything. So it's not that God demanded everything. It's that they said that they were going to give everything because it would make them appear better in the midst of the new church. They said, hey, we sold this and every single penny of it's coming to you. And it wasn't it's not that God says, hey, every single penny of that had to come to me. It's you said it was. Now it's a lie to the church. It's a lie against the Holy Spirit. And at the beginning of the New Testament church, God struck them down because that is not a lie that is allowed in this church. It is an example made at the beginning. Here, with the institution of the priesthood, the Old Testament church, we see the same thing. These two, Nadab and Abihu, come in and they try to do their own thing and to really just lift themselves up, the same as Ananias and Sapphira. The telling that we're giving it all is to lift themselves up, even though they didn't. They kept some for themselves, so they lied. Here, they're trying to lift themselves up, and God strikes them down just as quickly, because that is an example being made that, hey, this is not how you should be acting. You are not here to raise yourself up in the eyes of anybody else. You're here to be my people, not your own people. And so God made that example quick and fast at the beginning there as well. These sins all involved lying to God to bring honor to yourself. How unclean can one people be? When it comes to being clean, it seems as though there's an impossible task. You've read the clean laws, what it takes to be clean and unclean, and it's a lot. I'm not sure that anybody was ever actually fully clean. That's why they made all these extra laws to pad around it, to be like, oh, well, I broke one of our extra ones, but that means I didn't break this one, so I'm okay. Right? So they would make all these extra padding laws to keep them from breaking the actual ones. But let's talk about that uncleanness. Because God's intent is not just to put an impossible task before Israel. There's a reason for demanding them to be clean. And it's here to remind Israel that they were a holy people in an unholy world. The cleanness was always to point them to the ultimate cleanness that Christ would bring. But these laws always point back to creation and forward to paradise, right? And they also have to do with the fact that if you wanted to come to God, you had to be clean. Uncleanness was struck down by the very presence of God. It couldn't be in his presence. This is why they only sent a priest into the Holy of Holies once a year, and they tied a rope around him to bring out the dead body, because there was probably a pretty high chance of him dying. Because any uncleanness in the presence of God is getting destroyed. It's not that God says, oh, you're sinful, you're dead. It's that the very presence of God just burns away uncleanness, and that burns away the person who's unclean with it. So there was a reason behind this, and it was so that they could stay in relationship with God. The whole thing behind the cleanness was to keep them available to come to him. Because if they were unclean, they wouldn't be able to talk to him. They wouldn't be able to offer the sacrifices. Really, they would all get killed just as quickly from being in his presence. They wouldn't be able to. He couldn't reside amongst them. Otherwise, they would die. But let's talk about some of the clean versus unclean things. So there was the many laws about the animals being clean or unclean. The normal animals were the cud-chewing, split-hoofed animals. The hoof that's split-hoofed. If you want to have fun with the repetitive Hebrew sometimes. The cud-chewing, splitted hoof. Yeah. What that means is the cows and sheep, really. Tradition usually ties that to if you talk about creation and how God created the domestic animals, the wild animals, and the animals that swarmed the land on the sixth day. Tradition usually holds the cattle and the sheep as the domestic animals. And so there was a level of respect that went to them as animals that could be in the house without making it unclean. The animals that weren't clean, the wild animals and the swarming animals, that would be most of the time it was things having to do with death. So that was the carrion birds, the birds that ate the dead rather than actually hunting. That would be the disease carrying animals like the mice and the rats and the some of the insects that also made their nests with the dead animals and stuff. It also would have been the animals tied to the ground, because there was the ancient tradition. And let me say this with the traditions before we dive too deep into that. A lot of the laws God makes are to combat the beliefs in the world around him, around Israel. But that doesn't mean that God is acknowledging those beliefs as true. It means that he is separating Israel from what all these other people think. I want to preface with that because we're about to get into stuff like the blood has power, and the things of the ground are the things of the underworld. This is stuff that the other nations believe. And it isn't that God is saying that he doesn't have power over the ground, or that the fat isn't his, or that the bloods got power. But what he's saying is that these other nations think that. You aren't going to think that. And so his laws are addressing those things, but they aren't saying that those things are true. And saying don't eat the blood because other people think that blood has power isn't God saying blood has power. Does that make sense? Yeah. You can say no if it doesn't. It's okay. That's a good thing to address because we see a lot of this stuff referenced. The magicians, the blood magic, the eating of the blood to gain power, the blood being spilled for bad purposes. God isn't saying that any of that stuff actually happens, but he's addressing the fact that the other nations thinks it happens. So you're not going to do that because the other nations do. So there, we'll get into why some of these animals are unclean. The pigs, many of the things that run along the ground was seen anciently as belonging to the underworld, belonging to the realm of death. And so anything that lived in the ground was not clean. That would all be unclean as well. And God made that distinction there to keep them, again, separated from the other nations around them, where those things were perfectly fine for them to eat. They believed the ground was the underworld. This is all to separate Israel from those beliefs by addressing those beliefs. So that's where, because pigs would, at least, I guess the pigs from the time there, and maybe still today, I don't know as much about Iowa. You can tell me about pigs, right? There's more pigs than people here. Pigs burrow, right? At least over there they did. I don't know if they still do here. We put them in mud pits here.
It had to be before the
Yeah. They root. Pigs were connected to the ground. Don't ask me. Maybe it was a different breed of pigs. I didn't do that much research, so I'm not going to talk for 5 minutes on it. But they would have been tied to the ground as well. The insects that carried diseases a lot of the times were connected to death as well. And it went even further with them. So it's like if they landed on your food, the food was unclean and you had to toss it out. Part of that is to keep the people clean and have the separation. Part of it's also just for the health benefit. If there's mice and rats and insects that carry diseases, you don't want Israel catching those diseases. So part of what God is doing is also making sure that, all of his people don't die. And you see that actually had an effect. If you look at the Black Plague in Middle Ages, not that the Jews then were still God's people, but the rituals they still performed kept them from catching the Black Plague. And so if you look at maps of where the Black Plague spread, there's little spots here and there where Jewish communities were that just didn't get the plague because they ritually washed themselves. And the things that got touched were unclean. Fun fact. So there was also the health benefits behind God's law for the society of Israel. Some of these laws were also just to make life better for them and easier for them. What could Israelites not touch? That also has to do with the idea of dead things, right? So anything connected with death, part of that is that God, Yahweh, is the living God. He created things alive. Death was not part of the plan. Death is an aspect, a consequence of sin. And so all things related to death are also to be pushed away from God in that sense. That's also why we have all the laws with the blood, right? We'll talk about that just below here. But they weren't to touch corpses. They weren't to eat the animals that ate corpses, the bugs related to death. All of this had to do, the not touching always involved the death stuff. Always involved that, or as we'll see here, the emphasis on blood. But yeah, God is the living God. He, in creating everything, made things living, and death only came as a consequence of sin. I'm not surprised that God says, get these death-dwelling things away from me. I would say that makes sense. And now, why so much emphasis on blood? Pastor told me as he caught me reading through the hundreds of pages of Leviticus commentary, hey, Leviticus is all about blood is life. And so the quote here, the life of every creature is its blood. God says that. The life of every creature is its blood. Blood held life. Many pagan nations thought that it held power. So they would eat it to try and get stronger, to think that power would come to them. They'd use it for magic. They'd do even more with it. So they tied like spiritual aspects to the blood, because the blood was the life of the person. When there was no blood, there was no life. If you got drained of your blood, you were dead. If an animal was drained of its blood, it was dead. And so they all made connections to that. And it's not that God is saying there's power to it, but God is recognizing here that the life of the animal is in its blood, and he is the living God. So his emphasis, God's emphasis on blood, is to both separate Israel from their neighbors, but also because of God's love for life and hate of death. Blood wasn't meant to be spilled. So again, all these laws point to the resurrection, point to the new creation, where that blood won't be spilled, where the killing won't be happening. And we look again to that day. And these laws look ahead to that fulfillment of God's promise. All right. Keeping moving. The Day of Atonement. We get our scapegoat now. So the Day of Atonement, once a year, because obviously, as we already addressed, there's no way the Israelites are actually making sacrifices every time they sin. They would run out of animals really quick. The Levites would have way too much food on their hands, and the rest of everybody in Israel would starve. So there was no way for them to, there was no way they were actually making all the proper sacrifices every time they sinned. And God knew that. And so once a year, on the Day of Atonement, it was the ceremony that atonement was made for all of Israel. God's cleansing of the nation from whatever their sins have been. That's 16:6. Whatever their sins have been. The ones they know, the ones they don't. God makes atonement for that at the Day of Atonement. Atonement means simply to cover in any sense. The word is the word to cover. If you're talking about painting over a wall, that's also the word atonement. If you're talking about putting a lid on a pot while you're cooking, that's atonement. It's to cover. Specifically here, it's with God. It's his covering of our sin. Covering with something new, something different. Covering with us, the white robe of righteousness. So what happens during the Day of Atonement? You get your two goats, you bring them up, you get Billy and Bob. And Billy's going to get a new name and Bob's going to get sacrificed. So fun times, right? So they bring up the two goats, and on one goat, the priests all lay their hands on it, and all the sins of Israel committed throughout that year are placed on the goat. Spiritually, I mean, not every Israelite is just taking a chunk out of themselves. That's the little sin chunk. But on that goat is placed the sins of Israel, and it is now the scapegoat. They give it the name Azazel. Maybe you read that and had a question about it. We don't really know what that means. It could be the name of a demon. It could be the name of a place where they sent the goat to. The scholars aren't really sure. I'm sure there are plenty of internet theological fan fictions that have an idea of what it is, but we don't actually know. No scholar knows. But it was the scapegoat. We do know that. So we don't know what Azazel is, but we do know that it's the scapegoat and it was sent out into the wilderness. What Azazel means doesn't really matter for us theologically because we know what's happening and we know what is happening to the goat. That's the more important part. There are some things we just don't know because of history. That's okay to not know things. It doesn't diminish our faith or the accuracy of the Bible. It just diminishes our accuracy of being able to know things. And that's okay that we don't know things. We're not perfect. Yeah, Kathy? Is that Pastor? Is it? Okay. Yeah, so Yom Kippur. The day of atonement. Well, yeah, I guess, yeah. Yom Day Kippur. Yeah, there we go. The Hebrew of it. I guess I should know that. Yom Kippur. Yeah, the Day of Atonement. So on that day, every year, they would put all the sins on the one goat, and the goat would be sent off into the wilderness, and the goat would undoubtedly probably die there in the wilderness, dying for their sins, being sent out of camp. Their sins are being covered and taken away from them. And the other goat would then be sacrificed. So Billy's off in the wilderness with a new name, and Bob is now sacrificed, and the sins for that year have been atoned for. And this was a yearly thing because the Israelites never stopped sinning, because none of us ever stop sinning.
It always falls in late September.
It's they don't do a 12-month, they do a 10-month. And so it's always like the 10th day of the 7th month of something or other, however they make that sound. Something along those lines. September or October, that's what Pastor said. Yeah. Pastor is saying Yom Kippur and Passover are the two big holidays, and they're about 6 months apart. Hanukkah is a very small Jewish holiday. It's only large because of capitalism. They want to sell stuff, and why not use Hanukkah where you get 7 days of gifts? Yeah. All right. Good. Hey, we might actually get through this stuff. That's fun. Maybe. It's only 10:02 on the clock. 10:02 on here. I get 1 minute. Great. All of these laws that follow. So this is the big thing. 17 to 27, this last half of Leviticus, right? These are the laws that separate Israel from their neighbors. So the laws prior are looking at making Israel know that they belong to God. These laws here, especially the ones that we read, are the ones that separate Israel from their neighbors. And the big key here is that God mentions that these are the things that I will judge the nations by. So when we talk about, well, what Old Testament laws still apply, what don't, we can make that separation based on where God is applying the law. Here in 17, 18, 19 that we read, he's saying that these laws are for I judge the nation. So altars with idolatry. How does God's laws on whatever separate Israel from their pagan neighbors? Altars had to do with idolatry. Eating blood had to do with, I'm really glad I gave like a 1-sentence summary here for each of these. This comes down to a ban, eating blood becomes a ban on taking lives in the occult. The sexual relations, these sins profane God's established order of the family. God set up marriage and the family how it was supposed to be. All of these sins that the other nations do break that. And the planting 2 kinds of seed isn't that it's a literal thing. Well, it is. They were doing that, but it was to remember, to remind them to stay separate, that nothing should pollute your faith. No other story of everything should mix with yours. So God says, don't wear fabric of 2 kinds. Don't plant fields with 2 seeds. not because that's somehow inherently wrong to him, but as a reminder to the Israelites to stay pure. They were going into Canaan to conquer. So this was a law that, is kind of a gotcha statement to us, but it's not really, because this law meant keep your faith pure. There was a reason behind it, and this law was symbolical in that sense. There is the big takeaway. I'll let you read that on your own time. Boldly and confidently we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. All right, thank you all. Go Hawks.